This is Teresa, the art literacy coordinator for Lake Grove Elementary, introducing our May 2024 artist block, and that is MC Escher. MC Escher's full name is Moritz Cornelius Escher, and that's how it's pronounced, Escher. He was born in 1898 and lived until 1972, so a fairly recent artist compared to some of the other ones we've studied. Escher is a Dutch graphic artist, largely known for black and white prints. Looks a lot like charcoal drawings or pencils, but they're actually typically woodcuts or lithographs, and they're printed. We'll talk a little bit more about that. He was 32 years old when he created this self-portrait lithograph as a picture of himself by himself. And yeah, he wasn't a very good student, but he did excel at drawing, and so he took his career in that direction. Escher was always interested in capturing architectural details from unusual vantage points. So he used a lot of perspective, forced perspective. And in this woodcut, it's the interior of a crypt and it recedes into the distance. It gives that really, you can ask the students, what do they see? And it's a big open cavern, it goes very far back. You could ask, does this go far back or is it up close? And it goes very far back. And how do you know it goes far back? There's a lot of things. He's using 1-point perspective to create that sense of space. It's black and white with lots of contrast. There's a repetition of arches and columns and floor tiles, and it gets smaller and smaller, diminishing sizes as things go further and further away, which we've talked about before in other lessons. So it recedes kind of infinitely into space. And because, as I mentioned, a lot of these things are actually woodcuts or lithographs, so they're prints, which means that there's many, many copies of a single image that are in different museums. And so each of these slides has one place that they might exist in an archive, but actually they exist in many museums around the world. You can see original prints that are one of a series that were made. There are even some in our own Portland Art Museum, so students could go there and check them out. So how does Escher produce a feeling of space in this image? It's similar to the last one in some ways. Uniquely for older students, you might talk about the fact that there's two vanishing points. So distance going in two ways instead of just that one in the center as this one had. There's still the same though for everybody would probably notice there's repetition of the lines and the steps and the angles of the lines are directing in those directions, and that things get smaller and smaller and closer together as they go further into the distance. And it creates that optical illusion of great distance on a page. Here's another woodcut that was done early in Escher's career. This one is telling the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, where people were ambitiously building a tower to reach the heavens, and the story goes that the punishment for their pride was that God confused their language and made them all not be able to understand each other. That's how we end up with languages. This isn't really talking about that a bunch here, but it's kind of shown in the different skin tones of the people, even in the black and white. But what's interesting about this is the perspective you're looking in the other ones, where you're inside the buildings. When you're outside this one, you're from above. And so it's just a very unusual vantage point. And it gives that perspective of a really great height. It really drives home how tall this tower was supposed to be with the single vanishing point, but this time is at the bottom of the painting, of the print. So the vertical lines of the tower construction vanish towards that point, and the rectangular building shapes really just kind of emphasize that effect. This is another lithograph. Again, it looks like a charcoal drawing. It's not, it's a print. And Escher combined two different experiences of space. So here he's kind of doing something unusual where he's combining two different vantage points into a single image, and it kind of is mind-bending. So first there's the shallow space, the space that's kind of like just the vanity and the mirror that's sitting there. With some things that are on the table. And then there's what's in the mirror. The thing reflected in the mirror is the space, this street scene. And if you think about it, it is kind of an impossible situation. You can't possibly, you don't see a lot of things reflected. You see maybe the toothbrushes reflected, but the rest of the things are not really reflected there. Instead, you see this exterior building. So it's just an unusual kind of fantasy image. It's the reflection of some items, but then these public and private spaces mixed together. And that's kind of that duality or like paradox is kind of something that Escher experimented with a lot in his different works. Here's another one, a little bit different, more straightforward, but still very unusual. So in this lithograph, Escher has created another thought-provoking image with a hand, in a room, and there's not much around the exterior of it where the hand is holding the ball, but then in this reflection sphere, you can see it's a self-portrait. It's himself in the middle, and you can see a lot of other things inside the ball. What's interesting about this one too is that whether this could actually happen in real life, this image, um, he's mixed a lot of different perspectives. So not only dealing with the vanishing points and giving a great sense of distance with the very tiny chairs and tables at the very back and the way the books get smaller and smaller, but they're also distorted by the sphere and the way that the reflection in the sphere would work. So it's just very, I don't know, it's very interesting and very accurate to how that would probably be, but hard to render graphically. So here is one of Escher's first experiments with this concept called tessellation. And this is what our project is going to be. Tessellations can be very complex. This one's actually pretty complex. We'll do simpler ones, but the idea of a tessellation is this flat surface plane that has a lot of regular divisions that kind of repeat. And so you can ask the kids, like, what do you see here? And you could ask that about all of these. A lot of the Escher things will capture their imagination. So you go ahead on almost every slide and just ask what they see. In this one, if you pick it out, you can see men and women in top hats and fancy hair. There, maybe you can see the back of a woman, the top. You can also ask them to look at it upside down. Maybe I'll update the slides. The next one's with it upside down, because you can see there's some people are upside down in this image. So the tessellation isn't just one direction. In Escher's own words, about tessellation, he says, a surface can be regularly divided into or filled up with similar shaped figures which are contiguous to one another without leaving any open space. Without leaving open space is the important part there. So his work in this area is an extension of Moorish designs that he copied when he was in Alhambra in Spain. But those are typically abstract patterns, and he took it into a figure of humans and animals, which is not something that the Moorish artists were doing at the time or were allowed to do. So for this print, the designs for 8 different interlocking heads are on one wood block. So you can ask them to identify 8 different heads, different people, and you'll see if you can spot them all. And then the contrast of the black and white make this combine into a pattern. And I think the black and white contrast is one of the things that makes it so striking and also makes a tessellation successful. So talking more about tessellation, that's a little bit fuzzy. Maybe I'll try to replace this image, but a tessellation is the covering of a surface using one or more geometric shapes called tiles with no overlaps and no gaps. That's a basic definition. I might actually update this too, because mostly Escher did not use geometric shapes. He used other things, as you saw, very organic shapes, very complex shapes. But the whole idea that's very important here is no overlaps and no gaps. There's no dead space in these works, or no white space. The next thing that Escher did, though, was he took these tessellations and then put them into more complex. Again, he didn't always work with just one idea. He's always mashing together ideas. So this one is he explored the concept of transformation in it. So you can see that the birds are actually themselves translating from black to white, one to the other. And then he's put them against the backdrop of these towns, one in day and one in night. So you can ask the kids, what do you see on this slide? You know, is it, they'll see the birds. You can draw their attention to the left being a daytime scene with blackbirds and the right being a nighttime scene with white birds. Here's a simpler transformation scene, but still, so it really stands out, the transformations. And you can see in this one, again, he's playing with that tessellation. There is dead space, white space between some of these. But as you go from the top with the very realistic bird, they get more and more graphical. Towards the middle there, you can see that the shapes start to become like abstract representations or icons almost of each other. So that's the birds, and then the white space between them becomes the fish, and then the fish gradually get more realistic as you go down. So you can ask where, if they can find a positive shape bordered by a negative shape, and that's that middle row there. Here's one again where he's combining the previous thing we talked about, the buildings, with tessellation as an idea. And this is kind of a goofy one. This is called Cycle. You can ask what kids see in this one. The description in the presentation is that you see a jolly man running down the staircase at regular intervals. So you can see he comes through the top and then down the stairs, and as he descends the stairs, he becomes graphical and kind of falls into a pile of tessellation shapes of his own, and then that kind of sweeps up the top and becomes the blocks. So kind of an interesting cycle. of being like a person turning into the building blocks. In this lithograph, Escher's using tessellated exercise as a starting point to create a scene that kind of confuses those two. And we'll see this in a few other ones where there's like a flat surface and it turns into a three-dimensional representation and it goes back and forth. It's kind of like similar to the last one with the cycle. So in this one, the desktop items, which are all of, the book and the ink and the plant and all that, are sitting there on a flat surface to create a shallow space. And then the drawing of the reptile shapes are crawling out of that drawing, out of the sketchbook and up, and then coming back down. And here Escher creates a composition, again, that's very confusing, totally confusing the relationship of 2 and 3-dimensional images. When I showed this to my daughter, she did not realize at first that the background speckled part is part of the drawing. She was like, how did he make the drawing come out of the drawing? And I understood what she meant is like it looks like the paper is the boundary of this drawing. So just point out that this entire thing that's part of it, of course. And so the edge of the drawing is the shaded area, and the contrast of light and dark helps define what's realistic and what's standing out of the page versus what's meant to be flat and considered like conveying something as being flat as part of the drawing. So you can go through this with the older students, potentially talking about the realism and the abstract and how they kind of one rises out of the other. But I think in general, it's mostly about the concept here is just mixing the two and kind of tricking the eye. So here's a print that explores the concept of infinite deep space. It's pretty abstract compared to some of the others, but it does have some interesting things going on. So these are sort of sharks is the way they're described. You can think of this maybe as like a study, like colors, the way that we did the Kandinsky color study. It's like a study to see how the three-dimensionality can be conveyed. So they look three-dimensional, and what's making them do that is that they overlap, that they recede in view, like the things in the other drawings we've looked at, prints we've looked at. There's also some amount of like blurring. It kind of gets lighter and more contrast, lighter as you go further away and more contrasty towards the front. And there's these heavy lines. And then in this one, he's using color, and the color also is faded further away. So he's using color, but with a purpose. Here's one more where he used some color, and this one's tessellation. Again, not a simple tessellation, took something very complex, something simple and made it complex, where it's getting kind of fractalized towards the center. So the interlocking reptile shape repeats in rings, and then it moves towards the center, decreasing in half. So mathematically, very interesting. He was inspired very much by mathematics, and this one, I think, demonstrates that. Just one more to look at. This is a very famous one, the waterfall. So if you look at this, you can ask the kids to follow the water in the canal and see, would this be possible in real life? It looks at first glance like absolutely, no problem. You see the water kind of falling down onto this water wheel, and then it flows and it flows and it flows. And then you're like, well, how did I get to the top again? It's very unexpected. And so everyone's kind of seen this one, but just encourage people the kids to look at it and talk about whether it's possible to really have this happen in real life. We know water can't flow uphill, but somehow Escher's made it seem like it can in this print. And that is the lesson. I'm going to pause here, and come back with a separate video about the tessellation project. Thank you very much.